Hey everyone, I am Jess Peck, the Director of Member Engagement and Professional Development at VAR, and today we're going to go through the forms that are new and have been updated that will be released on September 30th, 2025. A couple overarching things for these forms. We are bringing them into industry standard for the text size and margins. So we're bringing it up to a size 12 font. We used to be at a size 9 at our smallest on some of the forms. This does mean that some of these forms have gotten longer, in particular the purchase and sale and the SPIR. So we'll go through all the changes. We also did some standardization of language. So we're using seller instead of owner, buyer instead of purchaser across all documents so that we can be consistent with those. So let me share my screen and we'll go through the updates and a couple new forms. So the first couple forms that we're going to look at here are the compensation agreements between brokerages. So this first one we renamed it. It is now called the Cooperative Compensation Agreement Buyer's Agency. It used to be called the Commission Allocation Agreement. And you'll see on the broker version, we have renamed that as well. That'll be the next form we look at, but it will match this. So it's the Cooperative Compensation Agreement Broker's Agency. So in this form, we did some correction in section 3. There were a lot of places that referenced agent instead of agency. So we corrected that since the compensation agreements are between agencies and not individual agents. In section 4, the update we did here, and you'll see this across other forms, anywhere where we have a percentage option for compensation, we have added checkboxes that let you choose whether it is based on the gross or net purchase price, and then defines what the net purchase price is, which is the total purchase price minus any concessions. So you'll see this on other forms that we are looking at as well. But those are the changes that we have here on the buyer agency version of this agreement. When we move to the broker agency version, again, we renamed it. So it's named Cooperative Compensation Agreement Brokers Agency. That means that both these forms will show up in the same place in the forms library on our vendors. And so folks will be able to find it easier since they are named the same, just with buyers or brokers agencies referenced. This form used to be called the Commission Allocation and Cooperating Agency Between Brokerage Firms Agreement. So we did some updating here, again, on language, as I mentioned, some places where we changed from agent to agency, owner to seller, purchaser to buyer. And then in section 8, you will see this is where we have the compensation. And again, where there is a percentage option as opposed to the set fee, we have the options of gross versus net purchase price for what that percentage is based on. So those are the changes that we have on these two forms. The next one that we have here is the exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. I'm looking at the designated agency firm version of this, but these same changes mirror onto the non-designated agency version and onto the buyer agency agreement, both designated and non-designated versions. So a few things that we did on here is to move the preferred location to its own line, which gives a lot more space to fill out. It used to be up next to the price range. Again, as we did on the other form, when we get down to the compensation, on the section A that gives an option for percentage, there's a checkbox for gross or net purchase price of the property. And again, the definition of what the net purchase price is. Section 5 had a bunch of language updates, but that is because this referenced that cooperation agreement with the brokerage firms. So because we renamed that form, we had to go through section A, B, and C on here and correct that form name now. So that's where the changes were made in this particular paragraph. In section 8, we fixed a little bit of grammar here where it talks about dual agency, where a real estate agent licensee represents the buyer and seller in the same transaction. It used to say real estate licensee from representing the buyer and seller, which was not the correct grammar there. So we fixed that. You'll see in here, we removed a section. So we removed the section that discussed the interest on a contract deposit. Because this is the buyer agreement right now, with buyers, we don't need to have that conversation about what happens with any potential interest on the deposit, and it is in the purchase and sale agreement. So we took this out of the buyer agreements, and next you'll see we took it out of the seller agreement as well, just because it wasn't necessary in here. And then on both of these buyer and seller agreements, you'll also see where we had a time here of midnight. We changed it to 11:59, just to be specific. It was a recommendation, a suggestion made by one of our members, and it was an easy change to make so that it was a more specific time. The next form that we have here is the exclusive right to market agreement. Again, this is going to be the same on the same changes on the designated and non-designated agency versions and on the exclusive agency market agreement. These changes will be the same across all of those. So the first one we have is section 6, again, compensation. So you'll see we added a little paragraph here that says in the event compensation referenced above is based on a percentage of purchase price, it shall be calculated based on the and checkboxes for gross or net purchase price, and again, the definition. Section 10, we did a little language update here in the mandatory flood disclosure section. So it used to say the flood risk, the flood status, and now it says the flood risks and status. And that's just to match the language that is in the legislative information on this requirement. Section 14, as I mentioned, you'll see we removed the information about the contract, the interest on the contract deposit. We did leave the other part of this paragraph, which talks about the forfeiture of contract deposit, because this is something that a listing agent would talk to their seller about. So this paragraph gives the listing agency half of the deposit amount in the event that the buyer defaults and the deposit is forfeited. That was in this agreement before. We just took out the paragraph that was right in front of it regarding the interest on contract deposit. And again, at the end of this agreement, we changed midnight to 11:59 p.m. The next form that we have is a new form. This is the disclosure to sellers regarding office exclusive listings. So as you've seen from Prime MLS, as of September 30th, if you take an office exclusive listing, this disclosure needs to be done with the seller. This disclosure explains to the seller that it is their choice to have an office exclusive listing, and it explains what that means. You know, they're not going to have a sign. There will be no print advertising, no advertising online, nothing on social media. It's not going to show up on websites like Realtor.com, Zillow, Homes.com. It does indicate that because they are not having immediate and broad exposure, this may mean that there might be fewer showings initially, that there might be fewer offers, and it potentially can impact the final sale price and terms of a purchase and sale contract. So it discloses all of this to the seller so they are fully informed if they choose to have an office exclusive listing. This is not something that you need to provide to Prime MLS unless they request it. And my understanding is if they request it, they give you 4 hours to produce this. So you will want to make sure on any office exclusive listings that you have this disclosure in order to provide it if needed. The next form that we have is another new form, and that is the wire fraud advisory form. Now, there is a wire fraud advisory paragraph in the listing agreements and buyer agreements. We added that last December with the major overhaul to those agreements. And you'll see in a minute, we are also adding it to the purchase and sale. This is a standalone agreement, so you can use this, you can use it anytime you want. I know some agents will use it with all of their listing and buyer agreements just as standard practice on top of the paragraph that's already in those agreements, just for extra information and extra clarity on being careful about wire fraud potential. Some people may only use this if they are working with a customer as a broker's agent, so they wouldn't have that buyer's agreement, in which case they may want to provide this to their buyer. Or perhaps they are representing a buyer and working with a seller as a FSBO. They may want to give one of these to the seller, so the seller has that information that they wouldn't normally see except in a purchase and sale contract. So it just gives that extra information. It's good information for our customers and clients to have, regarding providing information, using secure internet and Wi-Fi, depending on what you're doing on your devices, and what they should and shouldn't provide via unsecure email. The next form we have is the purchase and sale contract. So you'll see, as I mentioned at the start of this, the size, the length of this document did change considerably. This is 12 pages now, and you'll see some of that information that was on the first page has flowed onto the second, just because of the restraints on our font size and margins that we have. There was no way to get everything onto the first page. So you'll see as we go through that some of that has been bumped to the second page now. Because so many of these agreements are done via internet and, with e-signatures and that sort of thing, it didn't seem like the page number change is going to be a huge issue to our clients. This will allow them to read it easier and to follow along easier. And that was more important than keeping the document short. So what we have here, the first thing that we have is section 1. And this was just a very simple change. At the top we have the buyer and then the seller. So on this, we changed it to the buyer and then the seller. It used to be flipped. Seller used to be first. So we had buyer, seller, then seller, buyer. So we just changed those so they were the same order. It seemed to make a little bit more sense. The next section that we have that we made a change to is the contract deposit. So we added as evidenced by one or more of the following. So you'll be able to check off multiple options for the contract deposit. You may have two buyers that are buying together and they're splitting paying the contract deposit. Perhaps one is writing a check and one is doing an ACH transfer for something like Deposit Link. This gives you the option of indicating both of those things that are coming from different sources. The next change that we had is within the financing contingency paragraph. Now, here where we talk about how long that the buyer has to submit an application for financing, the language on this used to be based on a sentence that said the number of days after contract executed by buyer and seller and notices provided to buyer, which was kind of long. It could have been confusing to people. We updated this to just read the number of calendar days from the contract date. So much more straightforward and simple, and easier to understand. The premise is the same. We were going based on the number of days from contract date because that is the date that everybody knew everything. But it just wasn't as clear to the buyers reading this. The next piece that we have is section 9, the flood disclosure. So this just again reiterates the seller is supposed to provide the Vermont mandatory flood disclosure form, and there's a checkbox for yes or no. The legislative update states that this is supposed to be provided to the buyer at the time of contract signing or before. If it is not provided to them by the time a contract is executed, the buyer has the right to terminate the contract at any time up until closing or when they receive this document. So it is really important to get that to all buyers as soon as possible if they don't have it by the time the contract is signed. And this is for all properties: land, house, residential, commercial, multifamily, anything is supposed to have the Vermont mandatory flood disclosure. It doesn't matter whether it's on the top of a mountain and has never flooded before or whether it floods all the time. They all have to have it. The property inspection contingency, we updated a little bit of language here as well. This where it talks about if it is subject to a property inspection contingency that folks need to execute. And this used to be capitalized property inspection contingency addendum, meaning it referenced a specific document. And we know that not everybody uses that specific document when talking about the details of a property inspection. They may use a form that their office has created and provided. They may use a clause and either as a separate addendum or within special conditions. So we uncapitalized that, so we're not referencing a specific form, and added or clause so that that was covering the different ways that somebody may be giving that additional information regarding a property inspection, you know, what was being done, the timelines, that sort of thing. The next change that we had here is in this section. This used to say just condominium and common interest community. We added homeownership association, HOA, because that is more common language to the general public than a common interest community. We know that homeownership association is a common interest community, but the general public may not know that. They'll, you know, recognize condominium or HOA, but not necessarily common interest community. So we added that so that when folks are reading this, they can see that and, you know, recognize that that is what this paragraph is going to be talking about. Section 17 is a new section. This is a wire fraud, similar to what we have in the buyer and seller agreements. So again, just another reminder to everybody to be careful about potential wire fraud and how to protect themselves. The next section that we had to change on here was section 23 regarding contract deposits, specifically when it is in dispute. So the function of this section did not change. The steps are the same, the rights are the same, the timelines are the same. What we updated was there are parts in here that would talk about a disputed, contested dispute, which are synonyms. It didn't really make sense that that's what we were calling this. So we changed this to read contested contract deposits. So here where we talk about contested contract deposits, and in other parts in this paragraph, it used to say contested disputes, which didn't really make sense. We're talking about the contract deposits and what happened with the contract deposits in the event they are contested. So that is the change that we made to this paragraph. But again, the steps that the escrow agent is taking in these situations, nothing with that changed. In section 24, we simplified the language at the very end regarding if the deposit is estimated to earn more than $100 of interest, unless the person making the deposit requests it be put in a separate account, it's still going to be put in the pooled account. It's going to be very rare that you ever see a contract deposit that is going to earn more than $100 interest, unless you're doing some, you know, huge commercial deal that's going to span a really long time and deposits are going to be held a really long time. You're probably not going to see this. But in the event that that is coming up, we did simplify the language at the end here. The effect is the same. Again, we just made it easier to understand. And then the last thing that we updated on this agreement or on this contract is at the end here where we talk about written notice and effective delivery. We just updated the language so that it, again, was a little bit more simple and clear. So we have, you know, if a notice needs to be sent to the seller, it can be sent to a real estate agent or agency representing the seller identified below, a broker's agent agency acting as agent of seller's agency. And these used to be kind of flipped. So it was saying, you know, a real estate agent representing seller, agent or agency, listing agent or agency. It was just a wordier and just not as simplified as this is. So this is more simple, to the point, more understandable. So those are the changes that have been made to the purchase and sale agreement. The next thing we have is the compensation clause. So we used to have an acceptance of compensation clause and a rejection of compensation clause. We have gotten rid of both of those, and now there is just a compensation clause. You do not need to, based on our discussions and how the industry is working and discussions with attorneys, we do not need to reject the compensation before requesting something different. We can do this all together in one clause. So this just simply goes that it is a term of the buyer's offer. The seller agrees to have distributed from the transaction X%. Again, in that case, based on gross or net purchase price or a set fee at closing to settle the buyer's contractual obligations to their buyer representation agreement with, and it's going to list the buyer's agency. And then again, we have the definition of what the net purchase price is. And then the last bit here, there was a situation earlier this year where there was some confusion on somebody who had a cooperating agency agreement with brokerage firms and had a clause in the contract for compensation. The listing agency and seller believed they were referencing the same thing, so it was just that one fee. The buyer's agency and buyer believed they were getting basically that fee twice, that it was both of those and that those documents weren't referencing the same thing. So in order to avoid that happening again, we have added that this is the only fee that the buyer's agency will receive in this transaction from the seller or seller's agency. And then if the seller has authorized seller's agency to share a portion of the compensation being paid for services rendered, that portion will be applied to the total buyer's agency. So it just clarifies that a little bit here. Your office may have a specific policy regarding whether to do a cooperating compensation agreement or whether to do a clause in the contract. You really just want to have this memorialized somewhere, so you don't, unless your office dictates it, you don't need it both places. You can have one or the other. So this is just in those cases where there are two, trying to alleviate any of those confusion. We also have a compensation addendum. So the language on this is exactly the same as the compensation clause that we just saw. But the difference here is the compensation clause is fully editable. This is, within the block here, you can copy, paste it into section 12 additional conditions. You can modify pieces of this. But the other thing that you kind of need to do is edit it a little bit. So, you're putting in information, you're deleting some lines from here, you're, editing a little bit more than what some people want to do. So we created a addendum version as well. So this version is not editable. You can't change the individual language in here. And these blank lines that you see will be template fields that you fill in so that it is easier to have it edit without having to, delete extra lines. If you are using autofill, the buyer's agency would fill in here with the autofill. So it's just giving a little bit more flexibility depending on which way you want to do it. Either way is fine, clause or addendum. We just wanted to give folks both options. So the last form that we have here is the seller's property information report. This is the other form that changed length significantly. So you'll see this is 12 pages now. It is a lot for the seller to go through, but I think, with the editing that we did and the formatting changes that we made, this is going to be a lot easier for sellers to go through and take one question at a time and kind of, eat that elephant one bite at a time, if you will. So, going through and being able to answer question by question instead of some of these big blocks that had multiple questions in it. And you'll see with the formatting as we go through, we tried to standardize a little formatting as well. So where any questions where it was asking and had a yes, no, I don't know response, we formatted those same on the page so that they were easily recognizable and so that it flowed a little bit easier for folks. So the first thing that we have here is within section 1. This was actually a question that we combined and not split up. So regarding the question as to whether the road is maintained by a municipality, they have the yes, no, don't know. And it says, if no, how is the road serving the property maintained? And they have check boxes. That if no used to be its own question, but we moved it within the body of this question to match other places where we ask similar things. Where we ask if there are underground fuel storage tanks. We have if yes, has it been removed? When, where? So we're just following that same sort of format. Within section 2, the first thing we did was we removed the appliances and equipment from this section and made that its own section, since that is quite a meaty portion of this. And that allowed us to really focus on the mechanical, electrical, and other systems, and then the appliances. We did make these sections a little bit easier to read by putting a bold line between the primary and secondary heating system, and then again after the secondary heating system, again to just kind of visually break that up for folks so that they can easily see, okay, these are the questions are made regarding primary, and then these are the questions regarding secondary heating if they have a secondary heating system. We split some of these up, so like PQR here for the hot water system used to be all together and just ask all those questions in the same block. We split them up. So again, they can go one question at a time to answer, which we felt would be easier for folks to, again, kind of go one at a time with a document this large to not be overwhelmed by it. We did the same thing with TUV. Those used to all be together, the electric system. And again, we split those up. We also added knob and tube as an option under electrical system. That was not in there before, and some homes in Vermont do still have knob and tube. So we made that addition. Section 3 is now a new section, so other equipment, appliances, and fixtures. We copied these from the options that are in MLS, because we know a lot of people use this form when doing their MLS entering as well, so that it has this information for them and that these are all being covered. The other thing we did, again, this used to be all squished into one box, and it would ask what was included, then what was excluded, and then are there any issues with what's being included, which didn't quite seem like the right order. So now we have, 3A, which is what's included, 3B, out of the things that are included, does anything need repair or replacement? And then 3C, what is excluded? So it flows in a little bit more sense for that. We now have the news. We also separated out the telephone, internet, television, because it just didn't fit into one of the other sections really well. So now it's its own section, and we split up these questions again a little bit too, so that it flows a little bit easier and is a little bit easier to read through. In section 5, 5B, we updated this to be the year the building was constructed. It used to ask what the age of the building was, which meant we were making sellers do math, number one, which not everybody enjoys. And number two, depending on how long you've been in the business, you may remember listings that have been on the market for over a year, in which case that age has changed. It's now another year older. Whereas if we have the year the building was constructed, that's not going to change if the listing is on for more than a year. So just to kind of keep that consistent and not potentially having incorrect information on there if a listing is on the older side. In section 5C, where it's asking about have they built or had caused to be built, any of the buildings on property, additions, modifications, that sort of thing. It used to say, did you obtain all necessary permits and approvals? We took the word necessary out because it didn't seem like the word necessary was necessary. So it just now says, if required, did you obtain all necessary and approvals for such work? In the next section here, where we talk about items that have defects or malfunctions that need repair, the word significant used to be in here. So it used to ask about significant defects or malfunctions that needed significant repair. And we didn't want the seller, when they're filling this out, to start second guessing themselves on, is it significant? Is it not significant? If there's a defect or malfunction, we want to know about it. So we wanted to make this a little less subjective for the seller as they're filling it out, and not having to question, Is this significant enough to put in here that we're just asking about those defects and malfunctions and potential repairs? We did add one question here, question F. Now, other places in this document, we ask about the basement. Has there been water in the basement? Is there moisture in the basement? We ask about the roof. Has the roof ever leaked? But what we never asked about was any potential for other broken pipes or broken appliances that caused water damage in other parts of the house. Maybe there was a leak from a tub on a second floor that caused damage. Maybe there was a washer dryer located somewhere other than the basement that malfunctioned, the washer malfunctioned and flooded and caused damage. We didn't have a place that was addressing that. So that's where this question comes into play, to collect that information that isn't specifically asked elsewhere within this. Within the roof, we did have metal as an option for roof. We have changed that, taken just metal out, and instead put in standing seam metal and corrugated metal. So it's more specific as to the roof. This was another place where we split things up. So the whole roof section here, J, K, L, and M, used to be all together in one block asking these questions. So again, we split that up to be easier to follow through and answer question by question. Section 6, talking about the water supply. This was another place where we had these big blocks of questions, so we split these up. So this whole first part, the type of water system, was all one block with just a bunch of questions in it. So again, we split it up to go question by question within here. Same with the condition of the water system. It was one big section with all of these questions, which, led for the potential of a question to be missed or for somebody to be confused as they're going through this one big block. So again, we split this out. We did also remove a question. There was a question in here about if you have a water softener, is it owned or rented? That has been removed. After discussion, the committee felt that people didn't really have rented water softeners anymore, so that wasn't a question that was still needed. The sewer septic wastewater system, section 7. Again, the beginning here, we just split it into A and B, but that was all one block before. So we split that up. There was also an option in here under A for the properties connected to and serviced by. Driven Point Well was an option on there, which obviously is not, or shouldn't be anyway, a sewer septic or wastewater system option. So that was removed. That was in here by mistake before, so we corrected that. Again, the condition of the system was not, this was all one big block. So again, it was a little bit more confusing to go through. So we split this up again. We also added a question here about when the septic tank was last pumped. And we made sure when we were asking things about like when it was last inspected or last pumped, we asked who did that work. In section 8, we updated some language in here. You saw, all the things that we've gone through before. We're asking things like, to your knowledge, is anything, or do you know of, or have you ever? And in section 8, there were a couple of places where we were asking in the third person. So we were asking, does the seller currently occupy the property, or has the seller been notified of? So we modified those to read, are you currently occupying the property? Have you been received notice of a property reassessment? So just changing that language. So again, we're the last section that we have here, section 9, we made one change here where we ask if there are rental restrictions. That question was in here before, but we added the if yes, what is the rule? Similar to when we ask if there are pets, we ask what the pet rule is. Now when we ask about rentals, we ask what the rental rule is. And then the final change that we made on this document is at the end here under the seller's statement, and then under the acknowledgement by the buyer or prospective buyer. The parts that you see here that are bold used to be all in caps. And we didn't feel that we needed to yell at the seller and the buyer for this. So we changed that to be bold so that it is still highlighting those parts of these sections, but they're not all in caps yelling at folks. So those are the changes that have been made to these forms. Again, these are being released on September 30th, 2025. And if you have any questions, please reach out to the VIR office and we will do our best to help answer those questions for you. Thanks and have a great day.